Welcome back to another Unity RPG tutorial. So in this tutorial we're going to be taking the enemy that we created in previous tutorials. If you haven't followed the previous tutorials, I'll try linking them down in the description or the comment section below. But this is what we had basically set up from the previous tutorials concerning the enemy spawn and the enemy actually chasing the player. So the one thing that we haven't implemented yet, if the enemy gets too far away from their original spawn point, so the area that they're located, we want to make it so our enemy actually retreats and runs back to their spawn point if they get too far away. So this only applies to enemies that you want to keep within a certain area. That just makes sure that a player can't kite that enemy really far away or to different zones. And if you did want to include that in your game, you just wouldn't add this piece of code. They could just follow you forever if you really wanted to, or if someone else got aggro on the enemy. So what we're going to be doing is just jumping into our enemy code. We don't need to really add anything in Unity. But what we're going to be doing for our enemy is, well, first of all, we're going to be working in our enemy stats again. And the extra variable we're going to be adding is return to spawn point. So this is going to be keeping track if our enemy needs to return to the spawn point or not, if they're too far away from it. And we're going to be doing an action depending on if that's true or false. So what we're going to be adjusting is our main code for the enemy movement. So normally we just had our enemy randomly wander around or follow the target. But what we also need to include in here is checking to make sure that the enemy is not too far away from the respawn point location where they originally spawned at. So we're going to be doing that by just calculating distance again between the respawn point and the enemy. And our distance is going to be a pretty far distance. You can set this higher if you want. But once they get away from this point, when it calculates the distance between the two, if it's greater than 200, then we want to return them to the actual spawn point. So we're going to set target to null so it's no longer following the player. And then we want them to return to spawn point. So we're going to set that to true. And in here for target, we see return to spawn point. So once that's ticked to true, we're going to be returning to the spawn. And else, if we're not returning to the spawn, if we've already returned there, we want to just go back to searching for target and randomly wandering around. So that's what they will go back to once they reach that distance that we have set below. So right here is what we're going to be calling if we get too far away. So we'll just scroll down to that code. And this is our return to spawn. So it's similar to the code where the enemy was following the player. But in this case, the enemy is going to be looking at and going towards the respawn location. And then we're also going to be calculating the distance. And once they get within a certain distance from the actual spawn location, we want to stop the respawn or return to spawn point. So what this is going to do is it's going to change that to false, and instead of returning to the spawn point, it's just going to go back to wandering around randomly. So in this case, if I should state one thing, if you're going to be placing in Unity your spawn location up high, you're going to want the actual distance for the respawn point. So let's see, this is where we have our respawn point. It's kind of high off the ground a little bit, but if we had it way up here, you would want to go ahead and change this number to be higher for the actual return distance, because it's not just it's calculating all the position, or both positions, X, Y, and Z, from this point and the player point. So if there was a chance that this was too high up, and that number was still low and your enemy can't move upwards into the sky, they'll just sit there around that center location, just standing there, and they will not reset. So you just want to make sure if you run into that issue where they run back and they're just standing there, that you should probably increase this number to be a little bit higher to compensate for the Y axis. So now that we have all that set up, there's one more thing that we want to include, and that's going to be evade. Now, this is in our received damage code from our previous tutorial, or one of the previous tutorials concerning the player attacking enemies. And if the player tries to attack the enemy, you don't want the enemy to turn around and start attacking the player again. Maybe your player is, or that both the enemy and the player are too far away from the spawn point and you just want them to run back. So we use evade, which will pretty much just negate any attack, any damage to our enemy. Or else, if we're not returning to the spawn point, we want our player to deal damage. So right here we just print evade. Once we create some kind of combat text, you could pop up evade and let your player know that you can't attack the enemy right now because it's returning to its original spawn location. And you see that in a lot of MMOs. If you get them too far away from the spawn point and they decide to run back, and maybe you try hitting the enemy when it runs past you if someone else aggroed it, but yeah, the enemy should evade and go back to that spawn point. So that's pretty much everything we need for this. So we can jump in and we can check out the variables, and I'll show you guys how this works. And also I should state, if the enemy wanders too far away from the spawn point, even when they're not in combat with the player, that enemy will return to the spawn point as well. So we'll go ahead and select our enemy, and we can scroll down to where it says respawn or return to spawn point. And so we can see here that our enemy targeted the player. And once the enemy gets too far away, we can increase their speed for a little bit right now. So you just wait a little bit. Even if we're in distance of aggroing, you can see that they deselected the player as the target. And it's saying return to spawn point. And once they reach the spawn point, it unchecks that and they go back to wandering around. So one other thing that we did forget about is, if you guys wanted to include this same code for, let's say, the player being too far from the enemy, let's say since their spawn point is right around this area, but the player is able to sprint really fast out to this area, we could also calculate the distance between the enemy and the player, so that if the player and the enemy are too far apart, the enemy will just run back to that point as well. So you just say, we would use the same type of calculation that we used before while following. So if we just want to go back to our follow target code, we can add in a new line of code, which is going to keep track if the distance between the actual player and the target has exceeded a certain amount. So we're still using distance, we're still calculating that. Originally, this distance here is just calculating when we should be walking or not walking. So once we get close to the player, we just want to stop walking and start attacking. But in this case, it's just keeping track of, the target and the enemy, how far apart they are. And if we ever exceed 150 or whatever number that you set that as, we want to set the target to null and return to spawn point. So we're pretty much using the same code for resetting the actual enemy back to the initial spawn point. But yeah, we're just going to be throwing it in here, and that's a simple way to keep track of that. So that's pretty much all the code that we need for that. So we can jump back into Unity, and we'll go ahead, we'll open up the console, we'll reset that. So when our enemy spawns, and let's say our player aggroes the enemy within this area. So if the player decides to sprint really far away, you could see that the enemy is still close to the spawn point, but in this case the player is so far away and not going back towards the enemy that the enemy is just going to ignore the player. Since the enemy thinks the player is pretty much gone off, it's not going to keep following the enemy or the player until they get out to here and then go back. They would rather just reset around the respawn point or somewhere close to it and just start wandering again, looking for other enemies to interact with. So that's the basics of how this system is set up to work. So I can show you guys real quick. So we can keep track of in here, and we can go in here and just keep track of that return to spawn point. So in this case, we aggro, you can see the numbers. And you can see that they're still pretty much near the spawn point, and now they just completely ignored us and went back to the spawn point and started wandering around again. I guess what we haven't seen is them walk back or return to spawn when they get too far away initially. Unless we forgot to implement that. I believe we did forget to implement that as well. So we could also set it up so if the enemy, while they're wandering, because if we bring this up real quick, where's the actual wander code? So you'd want to set the actual distance between. So what we did before is setting up the distance from the return to spawn point. So in this case, let's see. Actually, it might still be working. I think they might have just not gone far enough. Because it should be being called all the time. Maybe we just didn't see. Because I believe they did respawn earlier, but yeah. If you did want to add that into just the wander code, you could do that as well. But in my case, I was just keeping track of it all the time. So yeah, anyways, that's a basic way to implement a return to spawn system for our enemy. In any other case, if you just want your enemy to wander as far as, they want to go, maybe add some more leeway for bosses, since bosses normally patrol around the whole entire area. I guess in the future we definitely have to go over a simple patrol system, because once the patrol leaves a certain spot, you probably want to remember that spot and use that as your target location. But anyways, I will see you guys in the next tutorial.